How effective was the longbow, and what damage did it do? Ladies and gentlemen, there are no two scholars that are better qualified than our distinguished guests to talk about this today. Kelly DeVries is a professor of history at Loyola University, Maryland. He is a specialist in medieval military history and has published a long list of articles and books on his subject. Among his best-known books are Medieval Military Technology, a look at Joan of Arc's military activities, entitled Joan of Arc, a Military Leader, a comprehensive and very valuable cumulative bibliography of medieval military history and technology, and too many more to name. Professor DeVries is on the Board of Trustees of the Society for Military History, as well as having played a role in founding the Society of Medieval Military History, known as De Re Militari, which is Latin meaning about military things. He's also well known for his many appearances on the History Channel, National Geographic TV, and PBS. I did my own research on him and found that he's fluent in Dutch. I lived in the Netherlands for 4 years. That's not an easy undertaking by any stretch of imagination. And on top of that, he's fluent in medieval Latin and medieval French. Cliff Rogers is a professor of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He is a specialist in the 100 Years' War, which took place between France and England in the 14th and 15th centuries. He also played a role in founding De Re Militari and is the author of numerous articles and books on his subject, including War, Cruel and Sharp, English Strategy under Edward III, 1327 through 1360, dealing with the 100 Years' War, and Soldiers' Lives Through History, the Middle Ages. He also has just finished editing the acclaimed 3-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare and Military Technology. And I've also had the pleasure of meeting with him before this. As a military person with a police background, I came to do my own reconnaissance and to see what was happening here. So I was here an hour early, and I was really indeed pleased to talk with Cliff, who gave me some straight information on a military legend and a story that I was going around telling, and I found out that it was incorrect. So I'm glad that he sorted me out on that. Together, these two historians have done perhaps more than any other scholars to convince the general military history establishment that the medieval period is worthy of study. Future generations of historians will benefit from a broader and deeper understanding of history because of them. We are very fortunate to have them with us here today. However, they differ on the efficacy of the medieval longbow, on how it developed and how efficient a weapon it was or was not. They have often argued the question informally at scholarly conferences. Here today, they will engage in a formal debate for us on the following terms. Professor Rogers will present his views first for 20 minutes. Professor DeVries will then present his views for another 20 minutes. Professor Rogers and then Professor DeVries will each have 10 minutes to rebut each other's arguments. For the remaining time, the floor will be open for questions, which Professor Crawford will moderate. Anyone may ask a question, our debaters, Professor Crawford, or members of the audience. Ushers will have mobile microphones which they can bring to you so that you can be heard. This will be fun. Please welcome Professor Rogers and DeVries. And Professor Rogers, please begin.
The word longbow dates to the 14th century, and everyone agrees that the weapons used by the English archers at their famous battlefield victories of the 14th and 15th centuries, where they regularly overcame odds of 2, 3, even 4 to 1, were longbows. A combination of documentary, iconographic, and archaeological evidence now gives us a clear understanding of the characteristics and capabilities of these bows. Each of them was made of a single stave of yew wood, which had compressible heartwood on the inside of the stave and stretchy sapwood on the outside of the stave. And these bows were not only long, several inches taller than the height of the archer, they were also exceptionally thick bows. Paolo Giovio, an Italian observer in the 15th century, described them as enormous, gentes in Latin, and Sir John Smith in the following century described English longbows as saying that they, quote, exceed and excel all other bows used by all foreign nations, not only in substance and strength, but also in the length and bigness of the arrows, as is testified by such as have traveled in many parts of Europe, Africa, or Asia. His claim is borne out by the weapons recovered from the wreck of the Tudor warship, the Mary Rose, I hadn't started my slide back at the beginning. Okay, there we go. The Tudor warship, Mary Rose. The bows are typically around 6 foot 2 inches tall, have thickness to width ratios of right about 1 to 1.1, which is much thicker than most sorts of bows, and a depth at the center of around 3.25 to 3.5 centimeters, which is really an extremely thick bow, which is what makes them so stiff. And they have draw weights, which is the amount of force you have to exert to pull them back at the greatest extent, of about 100 to 180 pounds draw weight. Now, if you may have done archery in gym, you may remember the feel of pulling a bow. You were pulling probably at 35 pounds or less with one of those bows. And modern hunters typically use, for hunting deer, use typically 40, 50, at most 60-pound draw weights. An indictment of the record of an indictment for murder in 1313 shows us that already in the early 14th century there were bows closely comparable in their dimensions to the Mary Rose bows in use. So it is that sort of bow that I mean when I refer to longbows, although some people would use a more expansive definition of that word. Now, since the late 19th century, most historians of the subject have accepted that the English adopted the longbow either as a new invention or as a borrowing from the West in the late 13th century, replacing the earlier short bow, which had been used by the Saxons, and also in a somewhat longer form by the Normans, who used their bows to very good effect at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, since the balance of evidence indicates that it was an arrow from one of these relatively short bows that struck King Harold of England in the eye and won the battle for the Normans. Archaeology, however, has since proved that weapons similar to the longbow in length and profile, though quite a bit less powerful than the Mary Rose bow, were used in Neolithic times by early medieval Germanic peoples and by Vikings. This fact recently led Matthew Strickland in an otherwise excellent book entitled The Great War Bow to argue that longbows were the normal military bows used throughout Europe right through the Middle Ages, and that historians such as myself, who had argued for the use of a significantly different short bow prior to the 14th century, like the one shown in the art on the top, that we had been misled by a too literal and unwary reading of the iconographic evidence, and that really what had changed was that artists got more accurate in their depictions and the bows stayed the same, that they had been longbows all along. Now, he is dead wrong about that. It would take me about an hour to support that assertion completely, but since my worthy opponent in this debate tells me he's now willing to concede that point, I will note that only the most conclusive evidence for the existence of the short bow preceding the longbow, which is recent archaeological work in Waterford, which has uncovered several bows, bow fragments and arrows, which show that the Anglo-Norman or Welsh military archers in the 12th to 13th centuries were using bows that were not even 2/3 the length of the Mary Rose bow. That's the Waterford bow on the left, in scale with a Mary Rose bow on the right. Admittedly, the archaeologist responsible for the report on the Waterford bows did not place much emphasis on the relatively small size of his artifacts. In line with the revisionist interpretation that culminated in the Great War Bow, he writes that much confusion has been caused in earlier literature by the mistaken assumption that the longbow is a distinct type of bow, qualitatively different from other wooden self-bows.